On a brisk October morning, Darnley Hall stood like a relic resisting time, its ivy-laced stone facade catching the last weak rays of autumn sun. The estate had hosted its annual harvest ball the night before, a tradition revived after decades of disuse by its newest resident, Charles Rathbone, a retired diplomat who had recently inherited the estate from a distant uncle. Guests from neighbouring counties arrived in fur-lined coats and polished shoes, the scent of old money and champagne mingling with wood smoke and candle wax. At precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, a housemaid named Elsie discovered Charles's lifeless body on the ballroom floor, sprawled beneath the grand chandelier. The sight was grotesque and theatrical. His left leg bent unnaturally, eyes wide open, and a single red rose tucked into his breast pocket. The chandelier, though looming above, remained intact. No blood, no sign of a struggle, no smashed crystal. A soft jazz record still spun on the gramophone in the corner, its needle scratching at silence. Panic erupted in the hall. The guests, many still nursing champagne headaches, were rounded up by the local constable, Inspector Graves, who found himself woefully unprepared for a crime of such refined eeriness. Charles's bedroom door had been locked from the inside. No footprints led in or out across the polished ballroom floor, and that red rose, who had placed it there? Most unsettling of all was the fact that Charles had, by all accounts, ended the party cheerfully at midnight and retired to his study alone. No one had seen him enter the ballroom again, and yet there he lay. Guests were asked to remain on the premises as the investigation began. They huddled in armchairs and milled about the morning room, nervously recalling the previous night's laughter, now turned sour. There was Lady Beatrice Winslow, regal and sharp-tongued, who had danced with Charles shortly before midnight. Young Martin Harcourt, a former protégé of Charles's from the Foreign Office, had arrived uninvited and left a bad impression. Evelyn March, Charles's housekeeper of 20 years, hovered nervously by the doors, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's. No valuables were missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. Charles's watch still ticked on his wrist, his wallet in his coat pocket. The coroner arrived mid-morning and found no visible wounds, no bruise, no trace of poison. Heart failure was suggested, but the expression on Charles's face, frozen, in a rictus of confusion, not fear, made the diagnosis feel incomplete. Why would a dying man place a rose on his chest? Or had someone else done it post-mortem? Inspector Graves examined the gramophone and the record. A song called Moonlight's Last Waltz. Unfamiliar, but recently cleaned, its sleeve still resting atop the cabinet. A guest mentioned it hadn't been played during the party. A woman's perfume, something sharp and citrusy, lingered in the air around the gramophone, though none of the women present claimed it. A set of fresh scuff marks lined the floor in a semicircle around the body, too symmetrical, too deliberate. When Graves asked about Charles's health, Evelyn hesitated. He'd grown wary, she said quietly. He mentioned shadows watching. Him, voices in the night. I thought it was drink or nerves, Lady Beatrice scoffed. The man had plenty of enemies in his younger years. Diplomacy is just sanctioned betrayal, darling. Martin Harcourt added another layer of intrigue. He claimed Charles had received a letter the week before that left him shaken. He didn't know the contents, but after reading it, Charles burned it in the fireplace and cancelled a planned trip to Vienna. The only other oddity noted was a set of muddy footprints in the eastern hallway leading away from the ballroom, but the gardener, Tom Bickley, swore he had passed through early that morning to fix a leaking window. The footprints, however, didn't match his boots. With the house in uneasy lockdown and tension mounting, the village vicar, who had been invited to the ball but left early, suggested calling in someone known for her insights into improbable puzzles. Someone with a habit of seeing what others missed. It was Evelyn March who quietly fetched the telephone and made the call to St. Mary Mead. By tea-time, a silver-haired lady arrived in a tweed coat and soft-soled shoes, her eyes alert beneath a lacy hat. She sipped her tea with delicate calm, listening, more than speaking, and surveyed the crime scene with unassuming interest. She noted the rose first, too theatrical for a sudden collapse. She examined the ballroom floor with a keen glance, spotting a faint smear near the wall behind the curtain, almost like a heel had slipped. Miss Marple tapped the gramophone gently and asked about the record's origin. No one could say. It hadn't been part of Charles's usual collection. The record label, when checked, bore no maker's mark, just the title in embossed silver. By nightfall, the guests retired to their rooms, unsettled by the notion that no motive, no method, and no suspect had clearly emerged. Charles Rathbone was dead in the middle of a locked house, wearing a rose no one admitted to giving, with a song playing that no one recalled owning. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, knitting untouched in her lap, her mind piecing together, the first pattern in a tapestry of misdirection. There was something off about the entire scene, not what was present, but what was missing. The crime was either too perfect or not a crime at all, but either way she was sure of one thing. The last dance at Darnley Hall had not yet finished its steps. Miss Marple rose early the following morning, long before the household stirred. The faint light filtering through the fog-soaked windows gave the hall a ghostly hue. She walked alone through the corridor leading to the ballroom, her steps careful, deliberate, absorbing the quiet tension embedded in the walls. The police had finished their initial sweep, and the body had been taken away under Inspector Graves's instruction. But it wasn't the body that held Miss Marple's attention. It was everything else left behind. She moved toward the gramophone and examined the strange record again. Moonlight's Last Waltz. No label, no maker. She ran a finger along the edge and frowned. The record was unusually cold, not the sort of chill from a cold room, but something metallic beneath the surface, unnaturally smooth. She tipped it toward the window to catch the pale light. A faint ridge circled the edge, not visible at a glance but unmistakably present. A fake label, a hidden mechanism. She tucked the observation away, knowing better than to speak before she understood. As she turned away, her eyes swept across the room one more time. In the far corner, just beneath the tall window where the curtains hung heavy and stiff, something had been overlooked. A faint, oily smear on the parquet floor. A crescent, perhaps from the sole of a shoe. She crouched slowly, pressing her fingers gently against it. The floor was clean otherwise, suggesting someone had attempted to wipe it away but left this edge behind. A hurried job. She straightened and returned to the breakfast room, where Inspector Graves sat hunched over a bowl of porridge, half-eaten and forgotten. He looked up as she entered, eyes weary. "Miss Marple," he said with a sigh. "I don't mind admitting this one's beyond me. No weapon, no wounds, no reason. You'd think he'd just dropped dead out of spite." She smiled softly. "People don't drop dead theatrically unless they mean to, or unless someone else means them to. May I ask about the guest list again?" Gestured to a stack of notes on the table. Everyone accounted for. Lady Beatrice, Harcourt, the vicar, Evelyn March, the gardener, a few locals. No one uninvited except that young Harcourt lad, and even he was let in formally. No strangers, no staff unaccounted for. Miss Marple nodded, then asked, "Has anyone examined the contents of Mr. Rathbone's study?" Graves blinked. "His study? Well, we had a look, mostly books and old correspondence. Nothing relevant." "But did he keep a guest book?" "Possibly. We didn't notice." She requested the key, and together they walked to the study. The room was orderly, almost too orderly, nothing out of place, but nothing of life either. The walls were lined with books, shelves arranged by topic, diplomatic histories, espionage accounts, treaties in multiple languages. A mahogany desk stood in the centre, its surface polished, only a crystal inkwell and blotter in sight. She moved behind it and opened the drawers gently. In the third, tucked beneath a folded newspaper from 2 weeks ago, she found a small black notebook. Flipping it open, she found a guest list from the previous night, names written in a neat looping hand, Charles's presumably. Next to most names were check marks. One, however, had a smudge beside it instead. A thumbprint, perhaps, or the result of something being scratched out. The name was nearly illegible, but she made out the shape of a G and perhaps an E following. She held it up. "Inspector, did anyone recall Charles inviting a Gerald or Geoffrey?" Graves shook his head. "Not a name I've heard." She closed the notebook slowly. "Then someone came who wasn't meant to, or who came under another name." Later that morning, she joined Evelyn March in the conservatory, where the woman trimmed dead leaves from an ailing fern. The housekeeper's eyes were red-rimmed, not from grief but fatigue and perhaps something else. Guilt or fear. "Evelyn," Miss Marple began gently, "how long have you been with the Rathbone family?" "Since I was 16, Evelyn said, softly. "First under Charles's uncle and then Charles when he returned from the Foreign Office. Did he trust you?" "Yes," she said quickly. "He confided in me more than he did with anyone else." "Then you might know, had he enemies? Enemies, not here, but in his work, yes. He often spoke of files he'd handled, people who had disappeared rather than testify, secrets exchanged for silence. But that was decades ago." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did he ever mention someone he'd wronged?" Evelyn hesitated. There was one man. He never said the name, just that the man had vanished after an assignment in Istanbul. Charles always wondered if it was by someone's hand, or if he had done too well covering his own tracks. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And did Charles dance at the ball?" Evelyn blinked. "Dance? Yes, last night." "With whom?" Evelyn considered. "He danced only once with Lady Beatrice. After that he kept to the edges, watching." "Watching who?" "I don't know." That afternoon, Lady Beatrice herself was approached in the drawing-room where she flipped idly through a magazine, more for show than interest. She looked up as Miss Marple approached. "My dear, do sit. Have you come to ask if I murdered Charles in plain sight while dancing with him?" "No," Miss Marple said with a smile. "Just whether he said anything odd. He told me I still had the sharpest eyes in the room, and that someone was going to try and make him disappear, but they'd be clever about it. I thought he was being dramatic. He didn't name anyone? No. But he kept looking toward the bandstand." Later, Miss Marple wandered out to the garden terrace, where the band had played the previous evening. The bandstand now stood empty, but beneath it, Tucked behind the speaker wires and music stands, she found something curious, an empty perfume bottle. Slim, crystalline, and recently broken. She picked up the shattered base with a handkerchief and held it to her nose. Sharp, citrusy. The same scent that lingered by the gramophone. She stood still, one thread connecting to another in her mind. A guest no one remembered, a record no one recalled owning, a perfume no one claimed, a rose that didn't belong. She returned to the ballroom once more and stood where Charles had lain. She imagined the scene, the music playing, a hidden figure, moving behind the curtain, a distraction, a lure, and something placed on the record, perhaps, a needle laced with something. Or had the music itself hidden a signal? There was deception here, not loud, not chaotic, but silent, polished, and precise. The kind of crime that left no visible wound, because it didn't need one. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her hands clasped lightly as if resting. She had seen the first threads of the illusion, but the tapestry had not yet revealed its core. Still, she was certain, someone had danced Charles Rathbone to his death, and she was beginning to hear the music they had chosen. Miss Marple sat quietly in the morning room as Inspector Graves gathered the principal guests for questioning. Rain tapped lightly against the window panes, and the air inside the hall felt denser than the day before, as though the walls themselves strained to hold in unspoken truths. One by one, the remaining occupants of Darnley Hall were called in, not in the order of their importance, but in the order of their willingness to speak. Lady Beatrice Winslow arrived first, poised and unbothered. She crossed her legs and folded her gloved hands neatly in her lap, her smile thin as lace. "I've told you everything, Inspector. Charles and I shared a single dance, exchanged the usual pleasantries, and I retired just before midnight. I'm not one for long festivities these days." Graves leaned forward. "Did Charles seem anxious to you, or distracted?" "He always seemed a little distracted," she said with a shrug, "but no more than usual. Though he did seem fixated on that gramophone for some reason. Stared at it half the evening like he expected it to play something on its own." Miss Marple's eyes flicked upward, but she said nothing. Lady Beatrice continued, her voice lightly mocking. "Perhaps he heard something only he could. Did you notice anyone near the gramophone?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lady Beatrice's smile didn't falter. "No one in particular. The usual scurry of servants refilling drinks. I saw Evelyn hovering near the stage, though, fussing about the sound system, I believe. Very odd for a housekeeper to be so concerned with music. Evelyn March was brought in next. Her hair was pinned with less care than the day before, and there was a faint tremor in her hands as she folded them on her lap. She avoided Miss Marple's eyes. "I was just making sure everything went smoothly," she said quietly. "Mr. Rathbone was very particular about the ball. He wanted it to be perfect. He hadn't hosted anything in years, and this was his way of stepping back into society, I suppose." "Did he seem nervous?" Graves asked. "Yes, and he kept asking whether anyone unexpected had arrived. He mentioned an old friend might try to surprise him." "Did he say who?" "No," she said, "just that he might not recognize him straight away." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You mentioned he burned a letter last week. Was it from this mysterious friend?" Evelyn hesitated. "I think so. He was unsettled afterward. Said it dredged up things that should have stayed buried." "Did anyone approach the gramophone during the evening?" Miss Marple asked. Evelyn looked down. "I saw Martin Harcourt standing near it. He didn't touch it, but he seemed interested. He watched it for several minutes before stepping away. When Martin Harcourt entered for his turn, he did so with the confidence of a man used to performing. He adjusted his collar and gave a half-smile that seemed rehearsed. I had no reason to be near the gramophone. I was invited, well, not officially, but Charles and I had a long-standing arrangement. He was my mentor once, you see. We had a falling out a few years ago, silly politics, but I came because I thought perhaps it was time to reconcile. Graves raised a brow. You didn't find it odd to arrive uninvited? Martin shrugged. Charles was a theatrical man. He liked bold gestures. Did you speak to him? No, he admitted. I waited for the right moment, but he was always surrounded by people. Then I saw him heading toward the ballroom alone later in the evening. I followed for a moment, then thought better of it. I returned to the main hall and had a drink. Who were you with at that time? Martin hesitated. I believe I was near the buffet. Lady Beatrice might have seen me. Lady Beatrice, when asked later, claimed she had not. As the day wore on, minor staff members were called. The cook recalled nothing but a missing bottle of white wine, which she assumed had been taken by one of the guests. A scullery maid mentioned seeing a man smoking alone behind the west hedge shortly after midnight, but couldn't describe him beyond tall and stiff. The gardener, Tom Bickley, brought in last, was muddy from tending the eastern side of the property. I didn't see or hear anything, he said plainly. Did my usual check of the side corridor around dawn. The window latch in the east hallway was still broken, like I said. I fixed it after I came in. Did you come through the ballroom? Graves asked. No. Took the side entrance near the pantry. But your boot prints were found in the ballroom, Graves said. Tom looked confused. I never went in there. Not since the day before when we were setting up the flowers. Graves frowned, flipping through his notebook. Miss Marple asked, Mr. Bickley, did Charles ever confide in you? He gave a dry laugh. Mr. Rathbone, confide in me? No, ma'am. He barely remembered my name most days. With everyone questioned, Miss Marple sat quietly in the library, eyes fixed on the guest book from the study. The smudged name still bothered her. There had been no Gerald or Geoffrey among those questioned, and yet a name beginning with G had been written and then partially erased or blotted. She examined it again under the reading lamp. The loop suggested a G, followed by what could be an R or E, then a downward stroke. She held it closer and suddenly stiffened. It wasn't Gerald, it was Graham, or more precisely, R. Graham. She left the library quietly and made her way to the records room by the back hallway, where Charles had stored years of Foreign Office files. Most were locked, but a few had been placed aside for sorting. She rifled through them quickly, and there it was, a letter marked Graham Redford, a name underlined twice. The accompanying note was short and cryptic. If he comes, do not let him. See the rose. She froze. Voices echoed from the hallway. Evelyn speaking in hushed tones to someone she thought was alone. Miss Marple stepped back into shadow. You shouldn't have brought it, Evelyn whispered. I had to, Martin's voice replied. It was the only way to make him listen. But he never saw it, did he? The rose? No. I placed it afterward. Miss Marple's breath caught. She turned back toward the firelit corridor, where shadows flickered, and voices of deception wove a tighter net with every passing word. Miss Marple remained hidden in the corridor's shadow as Evelyn's whisper faded and Martin Harcourt stepped away, unaware they had been overheard. Her mind began rearranging the puzzle with this new fragment. Martin had brought the rose. But why? And why would Charles's final instruction be not to let anyone see it? The rose was not a calling card, but a symbol. A private warning, perhaps, known only to two men with history buried under decades of silence. She returned to the drawing room with deliberate calm, finding Inspector Graves still thumbing through his notes, frustration writ plainly across his brow. She sat beside the hearth, hands neatly folded, and spoke softly. "Inspector, I believe we've been misled. Not through lies exactly, but through the careful selection of truth." Graves looked up. "You think someone's omitted more than they've said?" "Yes. And I believe the motives involved are more layered than we've considered. The question isn't just who would want Charles Rathbone dead, but which of them feared something being revealed by his continued presence." Graves tapped his pen against the table. "You're saying it wasn't revenge, it was protection." "Possibly. Both. Let's revisit each of them, not just for their access to Charles, but for what they stood to lose or gain." They began with Lady Beatrice. Wealthy in reputation but increasingly thin in actual means. Her estate had been sold off in parcels over the years. Her last remaining influence was social, her image. Charles had at one point been rumoured to possess letters written to him by Beatrice during his time abroad. Love letters, scandalous, in tone which she had begged him to return. Miss Marple remembered the glint in Lady Beatrice's eye when she spoke of Charles's fondness for drama. If such letters existed, their exposure could have embarrassed her in circles where reputation was currency. But would she have killed to suppress them? Unlikely. She was too shrewd to risk prison for pride. Martin Harcourt, on the other hand, was drowning in motives. He had once worked under Charles at the Foreign Office and was dismissed abruptly. There had been whispers, leaked documents, improper conduct, the kind of thing that ends quiet careers. If Charles had written a report, Martin might have spent years trying to trace its location. If the rose symbol meant something between them, a secret code or threat, then perhaps Charles had intended to force a confession or reconciliation by confronting him during the ball. Yet Martin's admission that he placed the rose only after the fact suggested he hadn't planned the death. Unless it was a lie meant to deflect attention from deeper intent. Evelyn March's position grew more complex. Devoted, yes, loyal perhaps, but too loyal. She had known Charles for over 2 decades. Had she grown protective of his secrets, or afraid of what might emerge in this return to society? If Charles had hinted at old betrayals or dangerous truths, perhaps Evelyn feared exposure, not of herself, but of what she had helped cover all these years. Her proximity to every guest, her concern with music, even her defensive posture in every question, suggested a woman tightly wound around something fragile. And then there was the gardener, Tom Bickley. Quiet, observant, outwardly irrelevant. Yet his boots did not match the prints in the ballroom. He claimed never to have entered. But someone had. Someone with access to both the grounds and the house, and just enough anonymity to pass unnoticed among servants and guests alike. Miss Marple considered the note in Charles's file. "If he comes, do not let him see the rose." It didn't specify Martin Harcourt. What if it referred to someone else entirely? Someone Charles had hidden from the others. Someone he feared more deeply. She recalled the muddy prints. If they didn't match Tom's boots, they must have belonged to someone who wore similar footwear, but with subtle differences. Maybe someone wearing shoes disguised to look like staffs. A guest, who'd prepared in advance to move where others couldn't. She returned once more to the ballroom, accompanied now by Graves and a constable. She asked for the print measurements to be rechecked against Tom's boots and Martin's shoes. Neither matched precisely. But someone else's did. Evelyn March. They brought her in quietly. "I don't understand," Evelyn said, voice trembling. "Why would I be in the ballroom? I've already said I was checking on the gramophone, just making sure the volume was adjusted." "But the print wasn't recent," Graves said. "It was pressed into the waxed floor well before the ball began, meaning you were there before the event started. Alone." Evelyn paled. "I had been setting things up, placing candles, adjusting the table layout. It was my responsibility to ensure everything was perfect." Miss Marple studied her closely. "Did Charles know you were in contact with Graham Redford?" Evelyn froze. Her mouth opened, then closed again. "I don't. He's not on the guest list. But you knew him, didn't you?" Tears welled at the corners of Evelyn's eyes. "He came to the servants' entrance the morning before the ball. Said he needed to speak with Charles privately. He said he was an old friend. He looked ill. I didn't recognize him at first. You let him in." "I did. And Charles was furious. He said if I ever brought Graham into the house again, he'd discharge me." But they argued, loudly. I heard Charles say something about the rose, how Graham had misunderstood everything, and that revealing the truth would put them both at risk. "Risk from whom?" Graves asked. Evelyn hesitated. "From the government." Charles didn't say exactly, but it had to do with something during the Cold War. Files that were never supposed to surface. Graham wanted them exposed. Charles didn't. He wanted to preserve peace, reputation, legacy. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So Graham was here." "He didn't attend the ball, but he was nearby, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting for an opportunity." "I didn't know he'd stayed," Evelyn said quietly. "I thought he'd left that afternoon. I never saw him again." "But you did place something on the gramophone," Miss Marple said gently. Evelyn looked away. "Just the record. He gave it to me before he left. Asked me to play it during the evening. Said it was an old favourite of Charles's." "And you did, without listening to it first?" "I didn't think he looked so desperate." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. The rose, the music, the presence of a man Charles feared. It's beginning to make sense. Not a single motive explains this death, but many motives collided. Charles knew too much. Others feared what he might reveal. And someone, perhaps Graham, intended that night to be a warning. But whether he planned for Charles to die remains to be seen. Graves looked stunned. "Then we're looking for a man who might not have been inside at all, but controlled." "The scene from outside?" Miss Marple nodded. "The maze of motives has led us here. To a dance arranged by many, but led by one. And now, Inspector, we must find Graham Redford, before he disappears again into the shadows he once came from." By midday, the following day, word spread quickly through Darnley Hall and the nearby village. Graham Redford had been found. A groundskeeper from a neighbouring estate reported seeing a man matching his description walking along a disused footpath that cut through the woods bordering the estate. A man, tall and gaunt, with a limp in his left leg and a scarf pulled high against the cold. The local police tracked the trail to a crumbling brick shed hidden among hawthorn trees, where they found a threadbare coat, a cracked pair of binoculars, and a discarded envelope bearing Charles Rathbone's handwriting. Inside was a single page, a typed list of names, 5 in all, each marked with a government cipher. Redford's name was among them. The others were unfamiliar. By late afternoon, a man was in custody. He gave his name freely, Graham Redford. He was older than anyone remembered, his skin like dry parchment, his eyes hollow but alert. He did not resist arrest. In fact, he seemed relieved. When asked about Charles Rathbone, he said only, "We tried to make peace." But he still danced to someone else's tune. The cryptic phrase was seized upon by Graves, who saw it as a final confirmation. "We've got him," Graves declared confidently. "Motivation, access, confession in all. But name. The rest is detail." Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, her knitting untouched in her lap. She watched the rain gather in rivulets along the pane, her thoughts threading through the investigation like the needles in her hands refused to. Something was off. She had expected Redford's presence but not his capture to come so easily. Nor did she believe a man with such a long and careful disappearance behind him would risk everything for a single night of confrontation, unless he knew it would be his last act. Later that evening, the residents of Darnley Hall began packing. Lady Beatrice announced she would return to London by the weekend. Martin Harcourt lingered near the library, too silent now, like a man who had lost his audience. Evelyn March disappeared into her quarters and did not come down for supper. The mood across the estate shifted from tense to oddly celebratory, as if the fear that had blanketed the hall had been lifted by the weight of a solved crime. But Miss Marple felt no such relief. She approached Graves just after supper. "Inspector, may I speak with Mr. Redford?" He hesitated. "There's no need now. It's all but finished." "Precisely why I'd like to," she said gently. "Just for a moment." He agreed, and they met in a small holding room the constables had commandeered in the village station. Redford sat on a wooden chair, his hands folded before him. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. Not recognition, but a kind of respect. "You're not with them," he said simply. "No," she replied, "but I've followed the rhythm of this dance long enough to know when a step is out of place." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Still going on about the dance, are they? You didn't kill Charles Rathbone?" "No," he said, "but I did come to watch him fall." "Why?" He closed his eyes. "Because I thought he'd come clean. I thought this little ball of his was the stage for a grand confession. But he didn't, even when I warned him, even when I gave him that record. You gave Evelyn the record, but—" "Did you know what was on it?" He looked at her sharply. "Music, just music. His favorite piece from our time in Istanbul. He used to hum it after a successful negotiation. Nothing more." "Then you didn't lace it with anything. I'm not a murderer." "But you brought the rose." His jaw tensed. "Yes. It was meant as a reminder, a private signal. I left it outside the library door with a note. Evelyn must have found it and misunderstood. Or someone else did." He looked at her carefully. "You're not satisfied with the answer they found?" "No," she said, "because your presence is convenient. Too convenient. And Charles's death, too clean." He leaned forward, slightly. "Then keep looking. There's more to find." As she left the station, her mind was already spinning back through the last few days. The clues that had surfaced too early. the evidence that arrived as if on cue. The arrest of Redford, neatly, timed, effortlessly wrapped. No one had questioned why the envelope with Charles's writing had been left so obviously. No one had wondered why Redford, if he truly feared exposure, would carry a list implicating himself. Back at Darnley Hall, she returned to the ballroom, now dim and hollow. The gramophone remained as it had been, silent and still. She examined the needle again, and then the underside of the player. This time she found what she had missed, a faint scratch, circular, around the center spindle. It suggested tampering, not with the record, but the mechanics beneath it. A vibration device, perhaps, something placed to trigger a mild but fatal physiological response when paired with sound, not poison, not violence, induced cardiac failure. And only one person had shown intimate concern for the gramophone from the beginning. She turned sharply toward the hallway. Evelyn March. She found Evelyn near the kitchen, wiping down a tray with a dish rag, her hands red from scrubbing. "I thought it was over," Evelyn said, not turning. "It would be if Redford had killed him." Evelyn paused. But he didn't. Miss Marple stepped closer. "No. He came to remind Charles of his past. But you feared what that reminder would unleash. You loved Charles, protected him. But you knew if he confessed to the things Redford hinted at, it would ruin his reputation. Everything you'd built together would collapse." Evelyn's shoulders tensed. "So you intervened. The gramophone was your tool. You placed something inside, just enough to trigger the weakness Charles had long ignored. A final waltz, with silence as your partner." Evelyn turned, her face drawn and pale. He was going to destroy everything. He had spent his life holding the line, keeping others from falling, and then he decided he was tired of it. He was going to tell the truth even if it meant losing everything we'd protected. "You weren't afraid of Redford. You were afraid of Charles. I only wanted to stop him. I thought if he fainted, if he got scared, he'd back down. But it worked too well." Miss Marple said nothing. The silence stretched until Evelyn sank into the nearest chair. Graves entered moments later, summoned by a quiet call Miss Marple had placed on her way back from the station. "You arrested the wrong man," she said simply. Graves looked at Evelyn, who did not protest. Her hands lay still in her lap, as if the effort of resistance had long since fled her. Outside, the rain finally stopped. But inside Darnley Hall, the final act of deception unraveled quietly, revealing not vengeance nor ambition, but a love, twisted into fear, and a silence meant to protect that had instead become permanent. The drawing room had grown hushed after Evelyn's quiet confession, and yet Miss Marple didn't feel the finality that usually accompanied the solving of a crime. Inspector Graves had taken Evelyn into custody with professional restraint, but a trace of unease remained in his expression as he departed. Outside, the trees swayed under the pressure of a fresh gust of wind, and the clouds had shifted once more, casting long shadows over the grounds of Darnley Hall. Miss Marple stood alone in the doorway, her gaze lingering on the ballroom's pale parquet floor, the gramophone now just a curious relic of a too-well-planned performance. Something still hovered, not unfinished, but unresolved. Later that evening, as she took tea alone in the library, she found herself leafing back through Charles Rathbone's private notebook, the same one that had contained the partially erased guest name. She flipped past the guest list and returned to the back pages, where smaller entries had been made in cramped, agitated writing. One particular page caught her attention, not for what it said, but for how hastily it had been crossed out. She tilted it toward the firelight. The ink had bled slightly from water damage, but the lines were still legible enough, initials and dates scattered like a ledger. And then a circled set of letters, M.H., dated 1983. She sat back. Martin Harcourt. She had assumed, like everyone else, that Charles's falling out with Harcourt had been over Foreign Office politics, perhaps something bureaucratic. But this looked more personal. She turned another page and found clipped to the margin a newspaper fragment, yellowed and brittle. A short article, half torn, but one sentence stood out. Foreign attaché dismissed following investigation into unauthorized asset contact. The name wasn't visible, but the date matched the entry, and beside it, in Charles's, the name written in Charles Rathbone's cramped, deliberate hand was Anya Volodin. Miss Marple stared at it for several moments, her mind reaching into the past. It was a name she had not heard in decades, but one that had once appeared in whispered conversations around post-war Europe. A translator turned alleged informant, suspected of passing information during her time in Ankara and later vanishing under suspicious circumstances. And now, somehow, this name was connected to both Charles and Martin Harcourt. The pieces rearranged themselves swiftly in her mind. This was never merely about a political disagreement or a personal vendetta. This was about the resurfacing of secrets too delicate to be named aloud. She closed the notebook and turned her attention to the remaining guests. Martin Harcourt, despite his earlier bravado, had grown increasingly quiet since Evelyn's arrest. He had not packed. He had not made arrangements to leave. Instead, he lingered in the library or wandered the gardens alone. Something bound him to the estate even now, and Miss Marple knew what it was. Guilt, not about Charles's death, but about the weight of what might soon be revealed. The next morning, she requested that the guests gather in the music room under the pretext of settling final matters. Lady Beatrice declined, citing fatigue, but Martin arrived promptly, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Miss Marple smiled as he entered, and without explanation she guided him toward the gramophone. "I've asked the staff to retrieve something," she said lightly, as if discussing the weather. "A copy of that peculiar record, Moonlight's Last Waltz. I'm told it was Charles's favourite." Martin hesitated near the doorway. "I suppose it held some meaning for him. I wonder," she said, moving to lower the needle. "Music has a strange way of drawing out memory, wouldn't you agree?" He didn't answer. The record began to play, the same delicate waltz, its melody haunting and soft. Miss Marple turned away from the machine and focused entirely on Martin's face. "There's something about this tune," she said slowly. "It reminds me of the garden parties in Istanbul, a time when Charles was very close to a certain interpreter." Her name, oddly enough, just came up again in one of his notes. Martin's eyes darted once toward her, then back to the gramophone. His jaw tightened. "Anya Volodin. Yes. I wasn't sure if you'd remember her." He laughed under his breath. "Hard not to. She ruined half a dozen careers. Some would say she merely exposed what was already corrupt." Martin said nothing. "I wonder," Miss Marple mused, "what Charles intended by keeping her name in that notebook after all these years. A warning, a memory, or something more recent. Perhaps he had learned she was still alive." The moment stretched, and then she added quietly, "Did you know Charles had begun to draft a letter to the EA Times?" "That was a lie," but it served its purpose. Martin turned sharply toward her, alarm flaring in his eyes for just an instant. She continued, voice calm and measured. He never finished it, but it mentioned the need to correct certain narratives, to acknowledge mistakes buried for too long. Martin swallowed. "What are you accusing me of, Miss Marple?" "Nothing. Not yet. But I find it curious that a man with so many enemies should have trusted someone with such a public disgrace still attached to his name. And even more curious, that you, Mr. Harcourt, who fell from grace so many years ago, have remained so carefully close to this case. When you said Charles ruined you, you didn't mean professionally, did you? You meant personally." Martin stepped forward, the music still spinning softly in the background. "He never told the truth," he said, his voice low. "He let me take the fall for that operation in Ankara. I wasn't the one who passed information to Volodine. He used me as a shield. The rumors, the dismissal, the disgrace, it all fell on me. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you came to the ball." "I came because I thought he would finally admit it. I thought perhaps with age he had grown a conscience. But no. He smiled, he danced, and he pretended it had all been forgotten." Miss Marple let the silence settle for a moment. "Is that why you tampered with the record?" His gaze snapped to hers. "What?" "The record. Someone tampered with the gramophone mechanism, enough to trigger a health episode, subtle, clever. The kind of sabotage only someone with a mechanical background or significant familiarity with the machine could manage." Martin's breathing grew shallow. "I didn't touch it." "I see. But you knew Evelyn had the record, and you knew what Charles's condition was. Did you suggest she play it?" He said nothing. "You hoped it would frighten him, that the music would unnerve him, that perhaps he would think Volodine had returned, that he would confess something in front of the guests. But when he didn't, and he died instead, you saw a chance to step back and let others take the fall." Martin stepped away, his shoulders tense. "I didn't kill him, no. But you set the stage for someone else to act, knowing what the pressure might do. That's guilt of a different sort, and Charles knew it too. That's why he wrote your initials next to Volodine's name. He wasn't planning to expose her. He was planning to expose you." The record reached its final note, a soft minor key that lingered in the stillness. Martin looked down as though the sound itself had stripped him of pretense. "You think you understand everything," he said finally. "But you weren't there. You didn't see what those decisions cost." "No," Miss Marple replied quietly. "But I know what it means to live with the choices we try to forget." He turned and left the room without another word. Miss Marple let him go. It was not a confession in the legal sense, but it was enough. Enough to understand that Evelyn had acted out of protection and Martin out of long-festering resentment. Neither had struck the final blow with malice in mind, but both had laid down threads in the tapestry that led to Charles Rathbone's death. The past, long buried, had risen not through violence, but through memory, through sound, and through the quiet unraveling of guilt. And yet a part of her remained alert, because in every dance there are always those watching from the edge of the floor, those who have not yet stepped forward, and not all shadows belong to the past. The following day, the air in Darnley Hall was thick with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. The guests had been told of Evelyn's confession, though the details were carefully minimized. A few had already packed, eager to leave the murky shadows of the past behind them. But Miss Marple stayed, her mind still turning over the fragments of what had occurred and what had not. It wasn't just the case that lingered in her thoughts, but the quiet sense of something not yet finished. The letter, the gramophone, Martin's guilt, Evelyn's fear, they all pointed to an unseen hand at work, pushing pieces into place, guiding the narrative of a crime that seemed too well scripted. Yet, the final act remained elusive. She had asked Graves to retrieve all of Charles's personal effects. His study had been scoured, but she wanted the books, the photographs, anything that might reveal a clue not yet found. For hours, she sat in the library, sorting through the papers, reading letters, inspecting old records. And then she found it. At the back of a ledger, marked with dates from the early 1970s, a page was missing. One page. Just a single sheet torn out with an almost clinical precision. The paper had been thin, fragile, and Miss Marple could almost see the careful, deliberate way it had been removed. Her pulse quickened as she rifled through the rest of the contents, but the void left by that missing page felt like an answer all by itself. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase it. She took the ledger to Graves. "Inspector," she said softly, "I need you to confirm something for me. Please check if any of the staff were given access to Charles's study this morning. We need to find out who could have had access to these papers after our last search." Graves gave her a questioning look, but nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'll check immediately." As she watched him leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that this missing page held the final piece to the puzzle. Whoever had taken it wasn't trying to hide evidence of a crime. No, it was much more deliberate than that. They were hiding something far worse. The clock ticked on. Graves returned an hour later, his expression unreadable. "I've spoken with the staff," he said. No one was in the study today except for one person, Evelyn. She went to retrieve some of Charles's personal items after her confession, but she swore she didn't touch the ledger. And the maid who cleaned the room earlier in the morning confirms the study was undisturbed when she left it. A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. Evelyn had been in the study. She was the last one who could have seen that page. Miss Marple had no reason to believe Evelyn had taken it, but the possibility nagged at her. It was too convenient, too neatly placed. Everything had been pointing to Evelyn, her love for Charles, her fear of what the truth would do. But what if someone else was playing a larger game? Evelyn was also the one who first found the letter in the study, Miss Marple murmured. The letter about Anya Volodin. It's likely she would have known about the missing page even before. "We did." Graves stood motionless, his face grim. "Then someone's trying to bury the truth." "But who?" Miss Marple asked quietly. The question hung in the air, unanswered. And just then, the door to the library creaked open, and the maid who had been cleaning the ballroom entered with a tray of fresh tea. Miss Marple turned to her instinctively. The maid's face was flushed, her hands shaky. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," the maid said in a low voice, "but there's something you should know. I found something strange, in the garden earlier." "What did you find?" Miss Marple asked, her curiosity piqued. "It was a letter, Mum. A crumpled letter, hidden underneath the hedge, as if someone tried to hide it in a hurry." The maid handed over the letter, now slightly damp from the morning dew, and Miss Marple's eyes darted over the words. It was typed, just like the letter in Charles's study, but it was unsigned. The message was brief. "The past cannot stay buried forever. Too many will be lost if it does. I have no choice but to act." Her fingers froze on the paper. The message was a warning, one that spoke of consequences far larger than the death of Charles Rathbone. This letter wasn't about one man's secrets. This was a plea, a threat, and someone somewhere had decided that they would not let it slip. Graves moved closer. Who could this have come from? And why leave it here, where it could easily be found? "That's just it," Miss Marple said, her mind racing. "It wasn't meant to be found by just anyone. It was meant to be found by someone who could stop the truth from coming out." She looked up sharply. "We need to move. Quickly, Inspector. Someone's trying to erase everything that could tie them to this, and I suspect they'll go to any length to keep that from happening." Miss Marple quickly summoned Graves's team to search the grounds more thoroughly, and the maid was instructed to stay in the kitchen out of the way. As the hours stretched on, the investigation seemed to stumble in fits and starts. No one was willing to admit to anything, and the more they dug, the deeper the layers of lies seemed to go. But then, as dusk began to fall, a sharp knock at the door interrupted Miss Marple's thoughts. She stood and opened it, only to be met by a stranger, a man wearing a heavy coat, his face obscured by the hood he wore. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, "I have information that may change everything." The man stepped inside, his presence unsettling. "Who are you?" Miss Marple asked, her mind already working over the possibilities. The man hesitated, then said, "I've been working with someone close to this case. Someone who's trying to cover their tracks before the truth catches up to them. They've stolen something vital, a key piece of evidence, and I can prove it." Before Miss Marple could respond, he handed her a small, folded piece of paper. She unfolded it, her eyes widening as she recognized the writing, Charles's own hand. It read, "The truth is buried in plain sight. It will surface when they can no longer hide it. Wait for the right moment." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she looked at the stranger, finally understanding. The game had just changed. They were no longer chasing shadows of the past. They were fighting to keep the truth from slipping out into the open, and someone was willing to risk everything to make sure it stayed buried. The evening air grew colder as Miss Marple stood by the window, her thoughts swirling like the autumn wind. Outside, the letter in her hand still trembled slightly, the words, "The truth is buried in plain sight," echoing in her mind. Whoever was orchestrating these events had been one step ahead every time, moving in the shadows, leaving behind cryptic messages and carefully planted clues. But now, with this latest letter and the cryptic stranger's warning, she could feel the tension tightening around Darnley Hall like a noose. As the clock in the hallway chimed the hour, a sudden crash echoed through the manor, followed by frantic footsteps and shouts. Miss Marple froze, the hair on the back of her neck rising. She rushed toward the source of the commotion, which seemed to come from the direction of the kitchen. The door flew open just as Graves and his team appeared from down the hall, their faces pale, their movements urgent. "Miss Marple," Graves said, his voice tight with panic. "It's Evelyn. She's gone." "Gone?" Miss Marple asked, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean, gone?" "She's missing." "Disappeared," Graves replied, his voice shaking. "The staff said she went to bed early, but now her room is empty, and there's a trail of blood leading toward the garden." Miss Marple felt a sharp jolt in her chest. She had thought Evelyn would be the final piece of the puzzle, the one to unlock everything. But now, in the span of a few moments, everything had changed. There was no time to question or hesitate. The villain, whoever it was still playing the game, and they had made their move. Without another word, Miss Marple followed Graves and the team toward Evelyn's room, her mind already racing ahead. As they approached, the heavy scent of something metallic wafted through the air. The door was ajar, and inside the disarray of the room suggested a struggle. Clothes were scattered, drawers left open, and the bed unmade. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was the bloodstain near the window, splattered in a way that suggested someone had been dragged across the floor. "Out the window," Graves muttered, his face twisted in disbelief. "Someone must have taken her." Miss Marple stepped closer, examining the window. The latch was broken, the glass cracked. It was clear that Evelyn had not left of her own volition. Someone had attacked her, and the blood on the floor suggested it wasn't just a struggle. It was an act of deliberate violence. The team quickly scoured the grounds around the window, but there were no clear signs of where Evelyn had been taken. The blood trail stopped at the edge of the garden, lost among the overgrown hedges. Miss Marple bent down, inspecting the soil carefully, but then something caught her eye, something unusual in the dirt. A small, crumpled piece of paper, half buried, under a fallen leaf. She unfolded it slowly, the writing faint but recognizable. It was another message, written hastily. "This is not over. The truth will never come to light. If you want to find her, stop looking for the past." Miss Marple's heart raced as she read the words again. The message was clear. The person behind all of this was not just trying to hide the truth. They were trying to bury it forever. And now, they had Evelyn as leverage. "Miss Marple," Graves said, his voice tight with frustration. "What does this mean? Who is behind all of this?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She was piecing together everything she had learned so far: the letter, the missing page, the strange clues, and the cryptic messages. This wasn't about a single murder. It was a much deeper conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond Charles Rathbone's death. Suddenly, it all clicked. "It's not Evelyn they want to silence," Miss Marple said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's the truth." "What truth?" Graves demanded. "What truth could be worth all this violence? The truth about Unraveling, and about what happened in Ankara all those years ago. They're trying to prevent anyone from uncovering what Charles and Martin knew. That's why they're trying to bury Evelyn, because she knows too much." Graves's face twisted in confusion. But Evelyn didn't know anything about the operation. She only knew about Charles's death. Miss Marple shook her head. "She knew more than we realized. She knew about Charles's involvement with Volodin, about the files he kept hidden and the choices he made. She's the key to everything." Just as she spoke, there was a sudden shout from one of the constables standing guard near the back of the manor. Miss Marple turned sharply toward the sound, feeling a heavy weight settle in her chest. Graves ran toward the noise, and Miss Marple followed quickly, her thoughts racing. As they reached the back gate, a scene unfolded before them that confirmed her worst fears. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows, stood at the gate. He had Evelyn, holding her tightly, a knife pressed against her throat. The moment he saw them approach, he shoved her roughly toward the gate, backing away, his eyes wild and panicked. "Stay back," he shouted. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "None of you do." Graves raised his hand, signaling for everyone to stop, but Miss Marple could see the man was already slipping away. There was no more time for hesitation. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a desperate attempt to silence Evelyn for good. Without thinking, Miss Marple took a step forward, her voice steady as she addressed the man. "You've gone too far," she said calmly. "Evelyn doesn't have what you need anymore. She was only trying to protect the truth." The man's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment there was a flicker of doubt. Miss Marple seized on it, her words cutting through the tension. Charles Rathbone's death was never the end of it. It's the beginning of something much larger, and you can't stop it. The truth will come out, one way or another, with the hour. Man hesitated, and that was all it took. In one fluid motion, Graves lunged, disarming the man and forcing him to the ground. Evelyn collapsed to the side, her body trembling but alive. The journal detailed a series of meetings with someone Charles had called simply G. No full name, no identifying marks. But the entries were full of references to meetings, to promises made, and to things that would never be allowed to see the light of day. There was mention of a final warning from G, dated just a few days before the ball. The message was clear. Charles had planned to expose something too dangerous to remain hidden, and G had threatened to eliminate him if he did. Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. She had always known that the case wasn't just about the past. It was about what had been kept hidden. But this was something new, something that connected Evelyn directly to the conspiracy, as well as to the missing page from the ledger in Charles's study. Evelyn had known about the journal, and she had hidden it in the garden to keep it from being found. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Evelyn's misplaced loyalty to Charles, her willingness to protect him, had blinded her to the fact that it wasn't just the secrets she needed to guard, it was her own. She had been hiding something much more valuable than Charles's memories. Miss Marple stood up, the journal clenched tightly in her hand. She had her answer now. The true motive behind Charles's death, behind Evelyn's actions, wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about a web of secrets too deeply intertwined with the government's covert operations to ever be allowed to surface. Evelyn had kept the journal hidden because it was the last connection to the truth that could expose everything, but there was more. The book wasn't the only thing Evelyn had hidden. As she turned to leave the garden, Miss Marple caught sight of something else, something tucked in the corner of the stone bench, nearly camouflaged by the ivy. It was a small, flat object, a thin envelope sealed with wax. Miss Marple picked it up and broke the seal. Inside, there was a letter, typed just like the others, but this one was different. It was addressed to Evelyn, and it was from Martin. "Harcourt, if you do not act quickly, everything we've worked for will be lost. It's too late to stop the plan, but we can control the outcome. Meet me in the garden before they come for the journal. There's still time to fix this." The letter was a threat, not just against Evelyn, but against anyone who knew the truth. Martin Harcourt had been part of something larger, something far more dangerous, and he had been trying to cover his tracks. His involvement, his desperation. To keep things hidden was becoming clearer by the minute. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment, taking it all in. There was no doubt now. The pieces had finally come together. The pattern was clear. But she knew there was one final move to make, one last twist to uncover before the truth could be fully revealed. The game was far from over. But Miss Marple was ready. As Miss Marple made her way back to the manor, the journal and letters still clutched tightly in her hands, her mind spun with the weight of what had just been uncovered. The carefully laid web of deceit, the hidden motives, the tangled relationships, all of it pointed toward a truth that now seemed inescapable. The crime wasn't about power nor revenge. It wasn't even about the government secrets that had been buried so long ago. No, this was about something far more fundamental, something far more insidious. Evelyn's actions, her blind loyalty to Charles, her willingness to protect him at all costs, began to make sense in a way she hadn't anticipated. But it wasn't just fear of the truth that had driven her to such extremes. There was something deeper, something that had been festering beneath the surface for years, something that had distorted her perception of right and wrong. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted when she reached the door to the library, where she found Graves still pacing, his brow furrowed with concern. He had been waiting for her return, and from the look on his face he knew something significant had shifted. "Miss Marple, I don't understand it. We've questioned everyone, we've found evidence, and yet it doesn't add up." "How does Evelyn fit into all of this?" Graves asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Evelyn," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but firm. "Evelyn didn't kill Charles because of revenge or to protect some hidden secret. She killed him because she thought it was the only way to preserve the life she had built around him." Graves looked at her confused. "What are you saying?" "Evelyn was not just Charles's housekeeper. She was his caretaker, his protector, and, in many ways, his enabler. She had become so intertwined in his life that she couldn't imagine a future without him. She believed, perhaps even convinced herself, that the truth would destroy everything they had built together, the life she had created in the shadows of his secrets." Miss Marple paused, her mind racing to make sense of the next step. "But there's more. Evelyn's obsession with protecting Charles wasn't just about his legacy or the truths he carried. It was about a far more personal connection, one that no one had even considered." She let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then, slowly, she continued, "Evelyn's relationship with Charles was more than professional. It was more than just loyalty. She was in love with him." Graves stiffened, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "You think she—" "I do," Miss Marple replied softly. She didn't just see Charles as a man with secrets. She saw him as a savior, a way out of a life she had long grown weary of. She believed that by preserving his reputation, by hiding his past, she was protecting him and, in turn, herself. But when she realized that Charles was finally ready to reveal the truth, when she understood that the journal he had kept for all these years was going to bring everything into the light, that was when the real danger began. Graves took a step back, his face hardening with the implications of Miss Marple's words. "So you're saying she killed him out of love? To protect herself?" Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. She had spent years covering up Charles's transgressions, keeping his secrets, living in the shadow of his past. But when he started talking about confessing, about exposing everything, she couldn't bear the thought of losing the life they had built. She couldn't let him go, not just because of the truth, but because of the love she felt for him. Love so twisted that it blurred her sense of right and wrong. And that's why she hid the journal," Graves said, piecing it together. "She thought she could control the outcome. She thought she could stop it all by keeping it buried." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "And it wasn't just about the journal. It was the truth that lay within it, the truth that could destroy everything she had worked for. She couldn't let Charles confess, couldn't let him undo everything they had built. And so she acted. She hid the journal, she erased the evidence, and when that didn't work, she resorted to violence." Graves was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. He had always believed in the simplicity of a case, a clear motive, a straightforward resolution. But now, as he processed Miss Marple's words, he realized that what had seemed like a simple murder was something far more complex, something deeply human, rooted in love, fear, and obsession. But then, where does Martin Harcourt fit into all of this? Graves asked, his voice tinged with doubt. He was so intent on getting to the truth, on forcing Charles to admit what he had done. He seemed to have his own agenda. Miss Marple paused, thinking carefully. Martin was part of the puzzle, yes, but his motives weren't as personal as Evelyn's. He was driven by his own need for redemption, his own desire to clear his name. Charles's betrayal had ruined him, and Martin couldn't forgive that. He came to the ball hoping to force Charles into confessing, but when that didn't happen, he resorted to other means. He thought if he could expose the truth, he could finally rid himself of the shame. But he didn't kill Charles? Graves asked, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. No, Miss Marple said firmly. Martin was many things, vindictive, resentful, manipulative, but he wasn't a killer. Evelyn, on the other hand, was willing to do whatever it took to preserve her own life with Charles. She didn't just kill him out of fear or anger. She killed him because she couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't there, protecting her from the truth. Graves nodded slowly, as though the weight of the revelation was finally settling in. So, the real motive wasn't just revenge. It was obsession, a twisted, dangerous kind of love. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly, and that's why the pattern is so clear now. The journal, the letters, the missing page, it was all connected to Evelyn's need to control the narrative. She didn't want Charles's past to ruin the life they had together. She wanted to keep him, even if it meant destroying him in the process. Graves let out a long breath. I see now. It's not just about the truth coming out. It's about the people who couldn't bear for it to be exposed. Evelyn wanted to keep Charles's secrets hidden because she was the one who had to live with them. She was the one who could never escape. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. And now, she's left with the consequences of her actions. As she looked at the quiet, empty manor, the weight of the case settled heavily on her shoulders. The truth had been uncovered, but at a great cost. Evelyn's twisted love had led her down a dark path, and now there was nothing left but the aftermath. The question now was not whether the truth would come to light, but whether anyone would be able to live with it once it did. The pattern had emerged, but the story was far from over. The truth had been revealed, but its consequences had only just begun. The air in Darnley Hall had grown thick with unspoken tension. Despite the investigation's slow unraveling, Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation was near. Evelyn's confession had shed light on the depth of her obsession, but there was still one piece of the puzzle that remained elusive. The truth, once buried beneath layers of lies and deceit, had finally begun to surface, but there were those who were willing to go to any lengths to keep it hidden. Miss Marple had spent the past few hours carefully planning, watching every move the remaining suspects made, trying to gauge their reactions. Evelyn, though visibly shaken, had stayed in her room, refusing to speak any further. Martin Harcourt had withdrawn into himself, pacing the grounds like a man waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to make their next move. But it wasn't Martin who Miss Marple was concerned about now. It was the one who had stayed in the shadows all along. Graves had been gathering information on the missing man, the one who had orchestrated the entire web of lies and manipulation. The man who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The man who, despite all the chaos, had never been fully brought to light. His name was Gerald Beaumont, an old acquaintance of Charles's, and a man with enough power and influence to bury the truth with a mere wave of his hand. Miss Marple had been waiting for him to make his move. She knew he wouldn't stay hidden for much longer. His involvement in the entire scheme had been too well planned to leave nothing behind. And she was right. Soon after nightfall, she received word that Gerald had been spotted near the estate, moving toward the garden with a determined stride. The time had come. Miss Marple called for Graves, and together they prepared for the final confrontation. She had already set the trap, a subtle yet unmistakable one, knowing that it would draw Gerald out without alerting him to her intentions. The plan was simple, but effective. She would lead him to the garden, the one place where the truth would finally be uncovered, and confront him there, where he believed no one would be watching. As they approached the garden, the moonlight cast long shadows over the path. Miss Marple could hear the soft rustling of the wind through the trees, the faint creak of the old wooden gate. Graves stood close behind her, his hand resting on his gun, ready for any sudden move. They moved in silence, blending into the darkness, until they reached the stone bench by the hedgerow, the very spot where the last piece of the puzzle had been buried. Miss Marple waited for what felt like an eternity, her senses heightened, her every nerve on edge. She knew that the moment would come, that Gerald would appear, and everything would fall into place. And then she saw him. He stepped into the garden, his figure tall and imposing in the dim light, his eyes scanning the area. For a moment he hesitated, as if sensing something was wrong, but then his expression hardened. He was ready. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "You've been careful, Mr. Beaumont. Too careful, but you can't hide the truth forever." He froze, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward her. For a split second he looked surprised, caught off guard, but it quickly turned to anger. "I should have known it was you," he spat. "Always poking your nose where it doesn't belong." "I've been following the pattern," Miss Marple continued, unfazed. "The pieces were all there, hidden in plain sight. The journal, the letters, the missing page from the ledger. It all leads back to you." Gerald stepped forward, his gaze cold and calculating. "You don't understand anything. This was never about Charles. This was about control. Power. You think I was just trying to keep some old secrets buried? No, Miss Marple. I was protecting everything. The people, the influence, the future." "You were protecting yourself," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "You used Charles, used Evelyn, used everyone around you, and when the truth started to slip through the cracks, you did everything you could to stop it." Gerald's eyes flickered with something darker. "You think I'm the only one who's done things to survive. People like Charles and I don't have the luxury of sitting back and letting the world unfold. We make our own way, even if it means destroying others in the process." Miss Marple took a step closer, her eyes fixed on him. "And you were willing to go to any lengths to keep it that way? Murder, manipulation, blackmail, it's all the same to you. All to protect the truth you've built for yourself." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Gerald's face. "You don't understand. If the truth came out, everything would fall apart. People would know what we've done, what I've done. That's exactly what makes you dangerous, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. You believe that protecting your own interests justifies everything else, but the truth can't be buried forever. It's like the garden. It grows, it spreads, and sooner or later, it has to be uncovered. Tense silence followed. Gerald's breathing grew heavier and Miss Marple could see the cracks in his facade. He had been a man who thought he could control everything, but now, with the truth out in the open, he was losing his grip. He wasn't the powerful figure he had once been. I didn't kill Charles, he said suddenly, his voice raw with frustration. But I did everything I could to make sure the truth never got out. I had to make sure the people I cared about, people like Evelyn, didn't have to live with the consequences of what we did. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. And now you'll have to face those consequences. You can't keep running from the past. It will catch up with you, whether you like it or not. At that moment, Gerald's face twisted with fury. You think you've won, don't you? He hissed. But you're wrong. You don't know the whole story. You'll never understand the things I had to do to keep everything in place. You're wrong, Miss Marple said softly. I understand perfectly. You've spent your life lying to yourself, convincing yourself that your actions were justified. But now, the truth is out, and you can't stop it. You've already lost. Gerald's expression darkened, and for a moment it seemed as though he might strike. But then something in his demeanor shifted. The rage faded, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He straightened as if accepting the inevitable. I thought I could control it, he muttered. But I never could I? Miss Marple didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth had finally come to light, and Gerald Beaumont, the man who had pulled the strings from the shadows, was no longer in control. His desperation had led him to this moment, the moment where his carefully constructed world had come crumbling down, and for the first time in years, the truth was free to breathe. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Gerald Beaumont, once the master of the game, stood broken before Miss Marple. His power, his control, his ability to weave lies into reality, all of it had unraveled in an instant. The garden, quiet under the moonlight, seemed to absorb the last of his defiance. Graves moved forward to make the arrest, the sound of footsteps on the gravel crisp in the silence. But just as the constables closed in on Gerald, something in the distance caught Miss Marple's eye, an unexpected movement, a figure darting through the shadows beyond the gate. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but then the figure reappeared, more clearly this time, and Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Before anyone could react, the figure moved closer, emerging from the shadows into the dim light. It was Evelyn. For a moment, no one spoke. Evelyn's presence, unexpected and completely out of place, had a strange weight to it. She wasn't running. No, she was walking slowly, deliberately, her face pale but composed. The moment she stepped into the garden, her eyes met Miss Marple's, and something passed between them, a silent understanding, a knowing that came too late. "Evelyn?" Graves asked, his voice a mix of confusion and suspicion. She said nothing. At first, simply standing there staring at Gerald with a look that could have frozen him in place. It was the same look she had worn the night of the ball, the look of a woman who had already buried too many secrets to count. "I'm sorry," she said at last, her voice breaking slightly. "I never wanted it to end like this." Miss Marple's mind spun in response. She had thought Evelyn was out of the game, that she had confessed everything she knew, But now, standing in the garden, Evelyn's actions told a different story. A story Miss Marple hadn't yet pieced together. You. Never wanted what to end like this? Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but edged with an unease that hadn't been there before. Evelyn took a slow step forward, her gaze still fixed on Gerald. I never wanted the truth to come out, she admitted, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. But I never wanted him to suffer either. What do you mean? Graves asked, his voice growing sharper. You confessed. You told us everything. Evelyn turned toward him, her eyes full of sorrow. I told you the truth I thought you needed to hear, she said quietly. But there's always been one thing I kept hidden. Miss Marple's heart sank as the pieces clicked into place. She had suspected this all along, but the final confirmation struck her like a blow. The journal, the hidden letters, the missing page. It was never just about Evelyn protecting Charles. She had been protecting something far more dangerous. Someone. She turned to Evelyn, her voice cold but firm. It wasn't just Charles you were protecting, was it? It was yourself. Evelyn's face turned ashen. I loved him. I didn't want anyone to know that I was the one who had been involved, that I had been part of it all along. Miss Marple's mind reeled as Evelyn's confession fell over her like a heavy cloak. You didn't just help Charles cover up his secrets. You were the one who started it. You were the mastermind. Evelyn's gaze faltered for the briefest of moments before she nodded. Yes, it was me. I did everything. I orchestrated the entire thing. The cover-ups, the lies, the manipulation. It wasn't just about protecting Charles, it was about protecting myself. I couldn't let anyone find out what I had done. Graves's face twisted in disbelief. You're telling me you've been pulling the strings all along? You were the one behind all of this? But why? Why go to such lengths? Evelyn took a deep breath, the weight of her actions finally beginning to catch up with her. Because I was scared. I never wanted to be exposed for what I had done. The mistakes I made, the choices I thought I could bury, I thought I could control it. But once the truth started slipping out, I couldn't stop it. I couldn't let everything I had worked for, everything I had built, fall apart. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, piecing together what she had just learned. Evelyn's confession had shifted everything. All along, Miss Marple had been looking at the situation through the lens of Charles and Martin. She had believed that the truth was hidden by them, buried in the past, but it was Evelyn who had set the stage for all of it. She had manipulated everyone around her, pulling them into a web of lies to cover up her own guilt. Evelyn's confession didn't end there. The journals, the letters, the missing page, it was all my doing. I wanted to erase it all. I thought I could make everyone forget what we had done. Graves stepped forward, disbelief still clouding his expression. But why murder Charles? Why kill him if you were the one hiding everything? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Because I knew he was going to expose everything. He wasn't just going to reveal Volodine's involvement. He was going to expose me, my role in everything. I couldn't let him do that. I thought if I could stop him before he spoke, I could protect myself. But when he died, I knew the truth was coming out anyway. She turned toward Gerald, her voice filled with quiet rage. And you kept me in the dark, Gerald. You made sure I thought you were on my side, that you understood the stakes. But you never cared about me. You only cared about protecting yourself. Gerald's eyes widened in shock, the anger in his face turning into something much darker. "You think I'm the villain here?" he spat. "You made this all happen. You pushed Charles too far, and now look where we are." Miss Marple watched the exchange with calm detachment. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about the final act, the culmination of everything that had been set in motion so long ago. Evelyn had been the true mastermind behind it all, but Gerald had become entangled in her web of manipulation. And now, both of them stood exposed, stripped of their power and control. As Miss Marple stood there, her mind racing, she realized something else, something that twisted the entire case even further. In trying to bury the truth, Evelyn had created a monster far worse than any secret. She had destroyed her own chance for redemption, and in doing so had trapped herself in a prison of lies. The final twist was not that Gerald had been the villain all along. It was that Evelyn had never truly been the victim. She had only been playing the part for so long, manipulating everyone in her wake, until the walls had finally come crashing down. And now, as the truth spread like wildfire through the night, Miss Marple knew that the end had come. Not with a bang, not with a confession, but with the quiet realization that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who hide in plain sight, waiting for their moment to strike. But that moment had passed, and now all that was left was the fallout. The night was heavy with tension, but the air inside Darnley Hall felt strangely light, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Graves, still reeling from Evelyn's confession, looked like a man who had been stripped of his understanding of the case. The weight of his disbelief hung around him like a cloud. Evelyn had been the mastermind, the puppeteer who had orchestrated this entire charade. And now that the truth was finally out in the open, he was left to make sense of the wreckage. The constables had been dispatched to secure both Evelyn and Gerald. Though they were no longer a threat to the investigation, there was a sense of inevitability in their arrest, like the final, inevitable click of a lock turning. For a moment, Miss Marple stood alone in the library, the journal still in her hands, the confession echoing in her ears. The clock ticked on, but there was something off about the way time passed now, too fast, too slow. She felt a restless stirring, a flicker of awareness in the back of her mind. "What happens now?" Graves asked, his voice tense as he joined her in the room. His eyes were heavy with the burden of the truth. "Evelyn's done it all. She's confessed. We've got Gerald too." "Not yet," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not everything's as simple as it seems." Graves gave her a look of disbelief. "What do you mean?" "She confessed to everything. Gerald's arrest is already in motion. The case is wrapped up." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. "You're sure the pieces all fit neatly together?" Graves frowned, glancing down at the journal in her hands. "What else is there, Miss Marple? The journal proves Evelyn's guilt. It's all there. Her obsession with hiding the truth, her manipulations, the murders." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes steady. "I'm not saying Evelyn isn't guilty, but we may have missed something important." Graves' face hardened with frustration. "We haven't missed anything. We have the confession. We have the evidence. What more is there to uncover?" Miss Marple's fingers moved lightly over the journal's pages, her eyes scanning the text. "There's something here," she said softly, more to herself than to Graves. "Something we overlooked." She paused, turning a page that had been stained by the dampness of the old journal. The ink was smudged in places, but the words were still legible. "This entry," she said, her finger tracing a line of text. "It doesn't fit with what we know. It's dated 2 days before Charles's death, and it mentions an unexpected visitor, a man named Geoffrey Rowe." Graves looked at her, confused. "Who's Geoffrey Rowe?" Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. "That's what I was trying to figure out. We've been so focused on Evelyn and Gerald that we never looked into the third person. Someone who was involved in all of this from the very beginning." "Evelyn mentioned no one by that name," Graves said, his brow furrowing. "Neither did Charles." "That's because they didn't know," Miss Marple said. "Geoffrey Rowe wasn't part of their world. He was someone from the shadows, someone who had been watching them." She turned the journal to show Graves the entry. "Here, Charles wrote about the man in a letter, one he had written but never sent. The letter was meant for someone else, someone outside their circle, but Rowe knew everything. He had been watching Charles for years, waiting for the right moment." Graves's gaze moved to the text, his fingers brushing against the page. So this Rowe, he was the one who manipulated Evelyn, who set all this in motion. Miss Marple nodded. He was the one pulling the strings. He used Evelyn's obsession to his advantage, making sure she thought she was protecting Charles when, in fact, she was being controlled by him. Graves shook his head, disbelief written across his face. "But Rowe's not here. He's not even in the house. How could we have missed him?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Miss Marple said quietly. "We were so focused on the visible players, Evelyn and Gerald, that we never thought to look deeper. Rowe has been hiding in plain sight the entire time. He's the one who made sure that the truth never came to light." Graves stood motionless for a moment, the weight of the realization settling over him. "You think Rowe is still out there, watching us?" "I don't think it," Miss Marple replied. "I know it." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hall, followed by the hurried sound of footsteps. Graves's hand instinctively went to his holster, but Miss Marple was already moving, her instincts sharp and certain. "Stay here," she said, her voice commanding. She moved swiftly down the corridor, Graves close behind, his steps heavy with uncertainty. As they reached the foyer, they saw the door to the library wide open. The room was in disarray, papers scattered, chairs overturned. A figure stood in the center of the room, tall, thin, and wearing a dark coat. His face was obscured, but the posture was unmistakable. "Stop right there," Graves shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. The figure turned slowly, his face now visible in the dim light. It was Geoffrey Rowe. His expression was calm, almost resigned. But there was something about him that made Miss Marple's blood run cold. This wasn't the face of a man who was surprised to be found. It was the face of a man who had been waiting for this moment. Rowe smiled, his lips curling just slightly. "I must admit, I didn't think you'd be so persistent," he said, his voice low and smooth. "But I suppose that's what makes you so effective. You've been pulling the strings this whole time," Miss Marple said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "It was you who orchestrated everything. Charles's death, Evelyn's manipulation, the cover-ups, and now you're here, to finish what you started." Rowe's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. "I didn't want things to go this far," he said softly. "But once Evelyn started acting on her own, once she thought she was protecting Charles, I knew I had no choice. She was too unstable, too emotional. I had to guide her to the final step. And now you'll stop at nothing to make sure it all remains buried." Miss Marple said. Rose's smile widened slightly. I'm afraid you're too late, Miss Marple. Everything I've done is already in motion. The pieces are already falling. Into place. The truth will never be allowed to surface. Graves stepped forward, his gun drawn, but Miss Marple held up her hand, signaling for him to stop. You've made one mistake, Mr. Rowe, she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. You've underestimated the one thing that can't be controlled, the truth. Rowe's expression faltered for a split second, his confidence wavering. And in that moment of hesitation, Miss Marple saw the cracks in his facade. He wasn't as invincible as he thought. You've lost, she said softly, almost pityingly. It's over. The moment stretched between them, silent but heavy, until Rowe finally dropped his gaze. There was no final confrontation, no grand escape, only the quiet collapse of a man who had believed he could control everything. You may have won this time, Rowe said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. But you can't stop what's coming. None of you can. Miss Marple watched him carefully as Graves moved to restrain him, his words lingering in the air like a final warning. As Rowe was taken away, Miss Marple turned slowly, her gaze drifting back to the now still house. The final twist, the hidden mastermind, had been revealed, but there was no satisfaction in it, no triumph. Instead, there was only the unsettling feeling that some battles, no matter how carefully fought, never truly end. The truth had been uncovered, but at what cost? The manor had fallen into an eerie quiet after Geoffrey Rowe's arrest, the chaos of the past few days now settling into a tense stillness. Miss Marple stood near the window, gazing out at the sprawling grounds of Darnley Hall, her mind still restless, even though the immediate danger had been contained. Graves had ensured that Rowe was taken into custody and that everything appeared neatly tied up. But as Miss Marple looked at the dimming sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more lingered, just out of reach. Graves joined her, at the window, his face weary but relieved. It's over, he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. We have Rowe. The case is closed. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on the garden, her thoughts far from the finality Graves seemed to embrace. Is it really? She murmured. Graves turned to her, puzzled. What do you mean? Rowe's the mastermind behind it all. Evelyn's involvement was uncovered, and Gerald, well, he's not going anywhere. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She had thought it over. Carefully, the way the pieces had fallen into place so neatly, but there was something about the way things had ended that didn't sit right with her. Rowe's confession, his sudden surrender, it was too easy, too smooth. It made her wonder if he had truly believed that his plan had succeeded, or if there was still something more that no one had seen. A small sound from the corner of the room pulled Miss Marple from her thoughts. The letter she had found earlier, the one addressed to Evelyn, still sat on the desk, its crumpled paper a lingering reminder of unfinished business. She had read the words again and again, but something about them still felt wrong, like they were part of a much larger puzzle that hadn't been fully solved. I've been thinking about this letter, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but deliberate. She turned to Graves, who had followed her gaze. Do you remember the part where Rowe mentioned the truth never coming to light? Graves raised an eyebrow. Yes, it seemed like a last-ditch attempt to warn us off. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That's exactly it. Rowe was always one step ahead, but that last comment, it felt like a final warning. A warning about what? Graves asked. There's something in that letter we've overlooked, she replied, her mind working through the details. Rowe's plan to keep the truth buried was never just about Charles's death or Evelyn's involvement. It was bigger than that, Graves frowned. You think there's more? Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the letter, and her fingers lightly brushed its edges. Yes, you see, Rowe's role in all of this wasn't just to protect his secrets. He was trying to protect someone else. Someone we've been blind to. Who? Graves asked, his voice laced with a mix of curiosity and confusion. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The letter wasn't just meant for Evelyn. It was a message for someone else entirely, someone who had a much more personal stake in this. Graves stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle slowly starting to fall into place. You think there's someone else involved? Someone we haven't even considered? Miss Marple turned to him, her expression steady. I do, and I think that person is still out there. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time Graves seemed to fully grasp the magnitude of what she was saying. There had been too many clues hidden in plain sight. The hidden letters, the cryptic messages, and now the final twist. Rowe's confession hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning of something much darker. Rowe wasn't working alone, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but resolute. There's another mastermind at play here, someone who's been pulling the strings all along. Graves was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. But who? If Rowe was the mastermind, then who else could be behind all of this? Miss Marple's eyes shifted to the desk once more. She thought back to the cryptic message she had found in the garden, the one that had come with the journal. If you want to find her, stop looking for the past. Those words kept haunting her, the phrasing, the implication that they were on the wrong path. The past wasn't the key, it was the future. I believe we've been too focused on the past, Miss Marple said. The truth isn't buried in the history of what happened between Charles and Rowe. It's in what's yet to come. Graves looked at her, his expression still puzzled but shifting toward something deeper. What do you mean? I think Rowe knew something we didn't, Miss Marple continued. He knew the consequences of what he had done, but I don't think he was the one who stood to lose the most. Someone else is in a position of power, someone who's been manipulating everyone behind the scenes, pulling the strings. Graves looked troubled. But who? Miss Marple's eyes widened in sudden realization. The letter. It was always meant for someone else, someone who has been watching us from the start. She turned quickly, her mind snapping to the obvious answer. She had missed it all along. The key was not in the shadowy past of political cover-ups, nor in the desperate actions of Rowe and Evelyn. It was in the people who had been hidden in the open, right under their noses. Miss Marple? Graves' voice shook her from her thoughts. Who are you thinking of? The answer was clear, but it came with a chilling certainty. Lady Beatrice, she said softly. Graves' face drained of colour. Lady Beatrice? Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. All along, we've been looking at the wrong suspects. Lady Beatrice has been pulling the strings, manipulating everyone from the very beginning. Graves shook his head in disbelief. But she's been right under our noses. How could we have missed it? Because she wanted us to, Miss Marple said simply. Lady Beatrice played her part perfectly. She knew how to work the room, how to hide in plain sight. She wasn't just a socialite. She was the one with the most to gain. And now, with Charles gone and Roe exposed, she's free to make her move. Graves's eyes widened. You think she's the one who has been orchestrating all of this? I do, Miss Marple replied. And I think she's the one who has been protecting the truth, her truth. She was the one who wanted Charles's secrets buried forever, and she used everyone, including Roe and Evelyn, to make sure that happened. Graves took a step back, his mind spinning as he processed the implications of Miss Marple's words. But what now? How do we stop her? Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. By being one step ahead, just like we've always been. As she spoke, the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The threads of manipulation, deceit, and hidden motives stretched across the estate like a spider's web, and at the center of it all was Lady Beatrice. The game wasn't over. Not yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. The truth was coming. But it wasn't going to be easy to uncover, and Miss Marple knew more than ever that the most dangerous thing wasn't the villain who had been caught. It was the one still waiting in the wings, watching everything unfold from the shadows. The mystery wasn't finished, not yet,